try to wear a couple of different hats, and I think those hats have heavily influenced me in terms of both the work that we do at SHOP as well as some of the teaching we do at Columbia, and this idea that Alec mentioned called the Center for Urban Real Estate, or CURE for short, which really is meant to be a provocation about the idea that real estate, which often is seen by general society sometimes in negative terms, can be an extraordinarily positive force for change. What's interesting is in the United States, about 60% of the population lives in single-family homes. Only about 4% of the population lives in a term that you're going to hear me use called hyperdensity. And by that I mean about 30 units per acre, which is not skyscraper density by any stretch of the imagination. It's really kind of a townhome kind of density. But it's the density that most transportation planners would agree is the amount of density you need to support a mass transportation system. If you have less density than that, essentially you're building train lines that are going to be empty because you don't have sufficient concentrations of population. If you look at the data, the further and further you get out from city centers, the more and more the carbon footprint is per capita. And I find many environmentalists are still confused about this because what they talk about is the fact, well, cities are heat islands. Yes, of course they're heat islands. But the issue is not so much whether cities are heat islands. The issue is how much energy use is there per capita, right? Because we're not going to solve this problem through fluorescent light bulbs and organic floor cleaner. That's not what's going to solve the situation. What you understand is that the closer and closer you get into center cities, that the more and more you can reduce the carbon footprint per person. Well, why is that? Because of the use of mass transit and because people who live in flats and apartments heat each other in the wintertime and cool each other in the summertime. As architects, we all know, anyone who's designed a single-family house, you know this, that it's a horrible thermal envelope, right? And no matter what you do to it, it's quite a horrible thermal envelope. But when you get into the heavier construction of city building, you start to understand how to unpack this problem that we have in terms of sustainability. This is why a place like Lower Manhattan is actually the greenest part of the United States, even though you don't see a lot of trees. 80% of the people who live in Lower Manhattan walk to work. Through the course of policy and government intervention, over the course of the last 20 years, 60,000 families have moved into Lower Manhattan. People, including my own family, we walk to work, we walk to school, and this is the way in which to reduce carbon footprint. But I also want to stress that in terms of this tie between sustainability and density, I'm not saying all of us have to live in New York or Hong Kong or Sydney. This is a fairly typical Japanese farming village. It looks very much like the farming village my father was born in. And what you notice about a place like this is the farmers cluster together. The farms are farmed outside of that village. So look at that village for a second. Think about the infrastructure costs and how logical that is as a way of living, even for a farm, right? It means that they have a sewage line, there's one sewage line, there's one trunk power line. There isn't a series of farmers living across the landscape that have infrastructure demands out to their individual pieces of land. So this is a scalable idea. It can exist at the rural level as well as the urban level. To me, the larger issue is, do we see it at a global level? And that if we really care about sustainability and that we really care about nature, perhaps we shouldn't try to live in it. And that perhaps that is the thing that will spoil it the most. And perhaps rather than taking a big truck to a mountain, we should take a subway to a skyscraper. And for the young people out there especially, I think this presents a monumental challenge, but also a monumental opportunity, in the sense that, are we going to take this 20th century technology of the suburb and bootstrap this technology on it in the hopes of making it better? Or are we going to actually start moving towards a more compact form of living that's largely tied by rail? Which leads to, I think, the next set of questions about cities, which is, do cities lead to health and joy? Because if I can stand up here almost in sort of engineering terms and say to you, well, it's better economically, it's better environmentally, you still might not buy it if you don't think you're going to live a more joyful life. Right? And of course, that was always the main argument for the suburbs. And it was the main argument that we had throughout the Industrial Revolution, that we had architects and planners starting back from Ebenezer Howard through Corbusier and so forth, whose main goal in their city planning visions was to kind of tame the city. And yet what was fascinating to me is that, at least in the United States, And we saw the city tame itself. And that the major public health issue, which was crime, right, drops precipitously in major US cities across the board from the 70s and into today. And in the converse, that the major public health issues that we have in the US today, in terms of chronic disease and so forth, that are linked to a lack of activity and linked to obesity, right, are fully correlated to how far out from the city that you live. To the point where, and these are American Medical Association statistics, that the further out you go from the city, chances are that you have obesity and all of the chronic illness that's associated with obesity. And then this is one of my favorites. This is a Swedish study that actually showed that as commute times increase, the divorce rates increase. So absence does not make the heart grow fonder, but in fact creates all sorts of other forms of stress. And then there's the act of driving itself, which is something that we so rarely talk about. The number one cause of infant mortality around the world is not HIV/AIDS, it is not malaria, it's auto accidents. It is the most dangerous thing we do.